The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as Judge Marilyn Carter adjusted her glasses and prepared to deliver the verdict. It had been a grueling case, one that captivated the nation. A high-profile child custody battle riddled with allegations, hidden truths, and a mountain of evidence that seemed to unravel more questions than answers. But as Judge Carter's gavel hovered in the air, ready to descend, a small voice cut through the oppressive silence. "Wait." Heads snapped toward the source. Standing at the edge of the plaintiff's table was a little girl, maybe 8 years old, her blonde curls bouncing as she stood on tiptoe to peek over the polished wood barrier. It was Sophie, the center of the custody dispute. Her lawyer froze mid-breath, while gasps rippled through the room. Even the opposing counsel's confident smirk faded as Sophie's wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto the judge. "I need to say something," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. The judge hesitated, her gavel now frozen in the air, as murmurs erupted among the spectators. "Young lady," Judge Carter said, her voice measured. "This is highly unusual, but given the circumstances, you may speak." Sophie took a deep breath, her little hands clutching the edge of the table for support. The room leaned in, collectively holding its breath. She blinked back tears and uttered 3 simple words. "Mom lied. Everything." The impact was instantaneous. A deafening silence fell over the courtroom. The judge's face drained of color, her professional composure shattered as her gavel slipped from her hand and clattered loudly onto the desk. "What did you just say?" Judge Carter asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie swallowed hard, her tiny frame trembling under the weight of the room's collective gaze. "Mom lied. About everything," she repeated, louder this time, her voice clear and unwavering. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Attorneys scrambled, spectators whispered feverishly, and Judge Carter's expression shifted from pale shock to something darker, fear. The bailiff tried to restore order, but Sophie's words hung in the air, a bombshell that refused to dissipate. Judge Carter leaned forward, her hands gripping the desk. "Sophie," she said, her voice shaking, "you need to explain what you mean by that." But before Sophie could utter another word, the courtroom doors flew open, and a man in a dark suit stormed in, his face red with urgency. "Your Honor," he shouted, "we need to speak. Now." Judge Carter stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor as she pointed to the man. "Approach." Immediately. As the judge conferred with the man in hushed tones, Sophie's father reached for her, whispering desperately in her ear. But the little girl didn't move, her gaze fixed on the judge as though she knew something no one else did. The whispers at the bench grew louder, Judge Carter's face tightening with every word. Finally, she turned back to the courtroom, her expression grim. "This court is now in recess," she announced, banging her gavel with finality. "Everyone will remain in this building until further notice." Gasps and protests erupted, but Sophie didn't flinch. Instead, she slid down from her chair and walked toward the judge's bench, her small footsteps echoing in the now silent room. "Your Honor," she said softly, her voice barely audible but steady. "I need to tell you the truth." Judge Carter's eyes flickered with unease as she motioned for the bailiff to approach. What truth could this little girl possibly hold that had the judge looking so rattled? The answer was far more chilling than anyone in that courtroom could have imagined. The courtroom buzzed with hushed murmurs as the bailiff escorted Sophie to the judge's chambers. Her father tried to follow, but a firm hand on his shoulder stopped him. "Let her speak," the bailiff warned. Reluctantly, he sank back into his chair, his face a mixture of confusion and fear. Meanwhile, Sophie's mother sat rigid at her table, her knuckles white as they gripped the edge. Her attorney whispered frantically in her ear, but she seemed paralyzed, her wide eyes fixed on the door through which Sophie had disappeared. Inside the judge's chambers, Sophie sat on a leather chair far too big for her small frame. Her feet dangled off the edge as she clutched a stuffed animal, a little gray bunny, tightly to her chest. Judge Carter entered the room and shut the door behind her, the tension in the air palpable. The judge sat across from Sophie, her stern exterior softening as she studied the trembling child. "Sophie," she began gently, "you've caused quite a stir out there. I need you to tell me exactly what you meant when you said your mother lied. This is very important." Sophie nodded, her lower lip trembling. "Mom said things about Dad that aren't true," she whispered. "She made me say them too." Judge Carter leaned forward, her brows knitting together. What kind of things, sweetheart? Sophie hesitated, glancing nervously at the bailiff standing near the door. The judge noticed her hesitation and motioned for the bailiff to step outside. Once the door clicked shut, the room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as Sophie took a shaky breath. She told me to say Dad hurt me, Sophie said, her voice barely audible. But he didn't. He never did. Mom said if I didn't, she'd make sure I never saw him again. Judge Carter's jaw tightened, her hands clasping together on the desk. And did you tell anyone else this before now? Sophie shook her head. She said no one would believe me because I'm just a kid. The judge sat back, her mind racing. The case against Sophie's father had been built on her testimony, a tearful account of alleged abuse that had swayed the jury and public opinion alike. But now, the very foundation of the case was crumbling. What made you decide to tell the truth now? The judge asked, her tone soft but probing. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. Because I don't want to hurt Dad anymore. He didn't do anything wrong, and he's always so sad. And I don't want to be scared of Mom anymore. Judge Carter's blood ran cold. Scared of your mom? Why are you scared of her? Sophie hesitated, clutching her bunny tighter. She gets really mad when I don't do what she says. Like, really mad. Sometimes she hurts me. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Judge Carter's professional demeanor faltered as she processed the implications. This wasn't just a custody dispute anymore. It was something much darker. Before she could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. The bailiff opened the door, his face grim. Your Honor, there's a situation. You're needed back in the courtroom. Judge Carter stood, her gaze lingering on Sophie. Stay here, she instructed firmly. We'll figure this out. As she returned to the courtroom, the chaos she had left behind seemed to have escalated. Sophie's mother was on her feet, shouting at her attorney, while the opposing lawyer gestured wildly, trying to regain control. Spectators whispered furiously, their curiosity now tinged with unease. Enough! Judge Carter's voice boomed as she slammed her gavel. The room fell silent once more. She fixed her gaze on Sophie's mother, her eyes like steel. Mrs. Harper, you and I need to have a very serious conversation. Mrs. Harper's defiance faltered, her face blanching. I don't know what you mean, Your Honor, she stammered. Don't you? Judge Carter's voice was icy. Because your daughter has just revealed information that drastically changes this case. And if what she said is true, then this court has been manipulated in a way that will not be tolerated. The room collectively exhaled, the weight of the revelation sinking in. But before anyone could speak, Sophie's father stood abruptly. Your Honor, he said, his voice cracking. Is Sophie okay? Judge Carter regarded him carefully. She's safe, she assured him. But what happens next will depend on the truth. All of it. As the courtroom held its breath, the judge's gaze swept over the room, her expression grave. This court is prepared to take immediate action to protect this child. Mrs. Harper, I suggest you cooperate fully, or you will face severe consequences. Mrs. Harper's face contorted, her composure crumbling. This is a mistake, she sputtered. She's just a kid. She doesn't know what she's saying. Judge Carter raised a hand to silence her. I'll be the judge of that, she said coldly. For now, this court will reconvene after a full investigation has been conducted. As the gavel struck, the room erupted once more. Sophie's father tried to rush to her side, but he was held back. Her mother slumped in her seat, her face pale and stricken. Meanwhile, in the judge's chambers, Sophie sat alone, clutching her bunny as tears streaked down her cheeks. Little did she know, the storm she had unleashed was only beginning. The courtroom's atmosphere lingered with a sense of unresolved tension as Judge Carter retreated back to her chambers. Sophie was sitting exactly where the judge had left her, her small figure curled up in the oversized leather chair. She glanced up as Judge Carter entered, her wide eyes searching for reassurance. Judge Carter closed the door behind her, her face unreadable. Sophie, she began, taking a seat across from the girl. I need you to know that you've done something very brave today. But it's important that we understand everything so we can help you. Sophie nodded slowly, clutching her stuffed bunny tighter. Are you going to tell Mom? She asked timidly. Judge Carter hesitated, choosing her words carefully. For now, you don't need to worry about that. My job is to make sure you're safe, and that's what I'm going to do." The door creaked open, and a social worker entered, her warm smile doing little to mask the gravity of the situation. "Sophie," she said gently, kneeling to the child's level. "My name is Amanda, and I'm here to talk to you about what's been happening at home. Is that okay?" Sophie glanced nervously at Judge Carter, who gave her an encouraging nod. "It's okay, sweetheart," the judge said. "Amanda just wants to help." The social worker's voice remained soft and kind as she asked Sophie a series of questions, starting with easy ones about her favorite things before gently transitioning to the more difficult topics. Sophie's answers were halting at first, but the warmth in Amanda's tone seemed to reassure her. "My mom gets mad when I don't say what she wants," Sophie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She says if I don't, she'll make sure I never see Dad again." Amanda exchanged a glance with Judge Carter, the unspoken understanding between them heavy with implications. "Has your mom ever hurt you, Sophie?" Amanda asked gently. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes she grabs me really hard," she said, showing faint bruises on her small arms. "And she says mean things. Like I'm stupid or bad." Judge Carter's fists clenched under the desk, her professional demeanor struggling to contain the fury building inside her. "Sophie," she said, her voice firm but kind, "you don't have to go back there. We're going to make sure you're safe." Just as Amanda was about to ask another question, there was a sharp knock at the door. The bailiff entered, his face grim. "Your Honor, we have a situation in the courtroom." Judge Carter stood abruptly, her spine straight as steel. "What now?" she demanded. The bailiff hesitated, his tone low. "Mrs. Harper is refusing to cooperate. She's making accusations about the court and claiming you're biased." Judge Carter let out a slow breath, her jaw tight. "Keep her contained," she said, her voice calm but laced with authority. "I'll address it shortly." Turning back to Sophie and Amanda, the judge softened. "I need to step out for a moment, but Amanda will stay with you." "Sophie, I promise we're going to figure this out." Sophie nodded, her grip on the bunny unwavering. "Please don't let her take me," she whispered. "You have my word," Judge Carter said, her voice resolute. Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Mrs. Harper was on her feet, gesturing wildly as her attorney tried unsuccessfully to calm her. "This is a setup," she shouted, her voice shrill. "That child doesn't know what she's talking about. This is all her father's doing." Judge Carter's entrance silenced the room. She strode to the bench with an air of authority that commanded attention. "Mrs. Harper," she said sharply, "you will sit down, and you will remain silent until I address you." Mrs. Harper hesitated, her face red with anger, but the piercing look in Judge Carter's eyes made her sink back into her chair. "This court will not tolerate outbursts or baseless accusations," the judge continued. "We are investigating serious allegations made by your daughter. Allegations that could drastically change the course of this case." Mrs. Harper's attorney stood, his face pale. "Your Honor, my client denies any wrongdoing and maintains that these claims are a result of undue influence by the child's father." Judge Carter raised a hand, cutting him off. "We will get to the truth," she said firmly. "For now, I am issuing an emergency order to place Sophie in temporary protective custody." The courtroom erupted, voices overlapping in protest and shock. Mrs. Harper shot to her feet, her face contorted with rage. "You can't take her from me," she screamed. "She's my daughter." "Bailiff!" Judge Carter barked. "Escort Mrs. Harper out of the courtroom if she cannot control herself." The bailiff stepped forward, but Mrs. Harper turned to her attorney, clutching his arm. "Do something," she demanded. "Mrs. Harper," Judge Carter said, her voice icy, "I suggest you calm down and cooperate. Any further disruption will result in contempt charges." The words seemed to cut through Mrs. Harper's hysteria. She sank back into her chair, breathing heavily, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for a lifeline. Judge Carter turned to the gallery. "This court is adjourned until further notice. All parties will remain available for questioning as we continue this investigation." As the gavel struck, the weight of Sophie's revelations hung heavily in the air. The room emptied slowly, whispers of speculation trailing behind the departing crowd. In her chambers, Judge Carter sat heavily in her chair, her mind racing. Sophie's brave words had exposed something far darker than anyone had anticipated. And as the investigation unfolded, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The lies in this case ran deep, and the truth would come at a cost. The courtroom sat eerily quiet after the crowd dispersed, but the storm brewing beneath the surface of the case was anything but still. Judge Carter returned to her chambers, her heart heavy with the weight of Sophie's words. The little girl's courage had cracked open a world of deceit and manipulation that could no longer be ignored. But Judge Carter knew this was only the beginning. In her chambers, Sophie remained seated with Amanda, the social worker, who gently guided her through more questions. Sophie's small voice filled the room as she recounted chilling details of her mother's behavior. How she was coached to lie about her father, how she lived in fear of her mother's temper, and how much she missed the time when her family had been together. Amanda closed her notebook, her face a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Your Honor," she said, turning to Judge Carter, "I recommend immediate intervention. Sophie cannot go back into her mother's care until a full investigation is completed." The judge nodded, already knowing this was the only viable course of action. "I'll sign the emergency order," she said. "Sophie, we're going to place you somewhere safe for now, where no one can hurt you." Sophie's eyes welled up with tears, but she nodded. "Will I get to see my dad?" she asked timidly. Judge Carter knelt beside her, a rare break from her usual stoic demeanor. "We'll do everything we can to make that happen soon," she promised. "Right now, we just need to keep you safe." Amanda stood and prepared to escort Sophie to a temporary foster home, but before they could leave, there was another knock at the door. It was the bailiff, his face tense. "Your Honor," he said, "Mrs. Harper is refusing to leave the courthouse. She's demanding to speak with you." Judge Carter sighed, her patience thinning. "Where is she now?" "She's in the lobby," the bailiff replied. "Security is monitoring her, but she's making a scene." Judge Carter glanced at Sophie, whose expression turned to one of visible fear. "I don't want to see her," Sophie whispered, clutching her stuffed bunny tightly. "You won't," the judge assured her. "Amanda, take Sophie out through the private entrance." "I'll deal with this." Amanda nodded, guiding Sophie out of the room while the judge steeled herself for the confrontation ahead. When she arrived in the courthouse lobby, she found Mrs. Harper pacing like a caged animal, her face flushed with anger. "Your Honor," Mrs. Harper shouted the moment she spotted her. "You can't take my daughter away from me. This is outrageous." Judge Carter remained calm, her voice steady. "Mrs. Harper, this is not the place or time for this discussion. Your behavior is only making things worse." "I'm her mother," Mrs. Harper shot back, her voice cracking. "You have no right to do this." "I have every right to act in the best interest of the child," Judge Carter said firmly. "And based on the evidence presented, Sophie is not safe in your care at this time." Tears spilled down Mrs. Harper's cheeks, but her anger didn't waver. "She's lying. She's just a child. She doesn't understand what she's saying." Judge Carter raised a hand, silencing her. "That will be determined through the proper channels. For now, you are to comply with the court's orders, or you will face additional consequences." Mrs. Harper seemed to deflate slightly, but the fire in her eyes remained. "You'll regret this," she hissed under her breath before storming out of the courthouse. Back in her chambers, Judge Carter sat down heavily in her chair, her mind racing. The case had taken a turn she hadn't anticipated, and the more layers she peeled back, the darker the truth seemed to become. Later that evening, Sophie was settled into a temporary foster home with a kind elderly couple who immediately made her feel at ease. She clung to her bunny but managed a small smile when the foster mother handed her a warm plate of cookies. As Sophie began to relax, her father sat in his small apartment, staring at his phone. He had left the courthouse earlier, torn between relief and anxiety. Relief that Sophie was no longer in harm's way, but anxiety over what the investigation would reveal and whether he would ever get the chance to rebuild their lives together. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was his lawyer. "We have a problem," the lawyer said without preamble. "There's been a new development." "What now?" Sophie's father asked, his heart sinking. "Mrs. Harper has filed a motion to dismiss the investigation, claiming she's being unfairly targeted by the court," the lawyer explained. "She's doubling down on her story and accusing Sophie of being manipulated by you." "What?" he exclaimed. "That's absurd." Sophie finally told the truth, and now she's trying to twist it again. The lawyer sighed. It's a tactic, but a dangerous one. We'll fight it, but you need to be prepared. This isn't over. In the dead of night, Judge Carter sat in her home office, poring over the case files. Her mind returned to Sophie's trembling voice, the way her small hands clutched the stuffed bunny as she spoke her truth. This wasn't just another case, it was a battle for a child's future, and the stakes were impossibly high. As the clock ticked past midnight, the judge leaned back in her chair, her eyes falling on a photograph of her own children on her desk. The weight of the case pressed down on her chest, but she knew one thing for certain: she would not let Sophie's bravery go in vain. But little did Judge Carter know, the next twist in this case would challenge everything she thought she knew about justice and truth. What would you have done if you were in Judge Carter's position? Should Sophie's words be enough to change the entire case, or should more evidence be required? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with your friends. The courthouse buzzed with tension the next morning as the investigation into Sophie's claims took on new urgency. Judge Carter convened a closed-door hearing, ensuring only essential personnel, attorneys, and Sophie's parents were present. The stakes had escalated overnight with Mrs. Harper's motion to dismiss the investigation, but the judge wasn't about to let her derail the truth. The hearing began with Sophie's father's lawyer, Mr. Daniels, presenting evidence that Sophie's claims warranted further scrutiny. "Your Honor," Daniels said, gesturing toward a stack of documents, "these medical records and testimonials suggest a pattern of coercion and emotional abuse consistent with Sophie's allegations." Mrs. Harper's lawyer, Ms. Latham, countered, her tone sharp. "This so-called evidence is circumstantial at best. We're talking about the testimony of an 8-year-old child, one who's been under significant stress and may have been influenced by her father." Judge Carter held up a hand, silencing both sides. "I will hear from Sophie herself," she announced. "Given the nature of her claims, it's crucial we understand her perspective without external pressure." Mrs. Harper shot out of her seat. "She's just a child," she exclaimed. "She doesn't know what she's saying." Judge Carter's gaze was unyielding. "Mrs. Harper, I suggest you sit down. You'll have the opportunity to respond after Sophie's testimony." The tension in the room thickened as Sophie was brought in, her small figure dwarfed by the gravity of the moment. She looked around nervously but relaxed slightly when she saw Judge Carter's kind expression. "Sophie," the judge said gently, "you've already been very brave, and I need you to be brave again today. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and I want you to answer as truthfully as you can. Can you do that for me?" Sophie nodded, clutching her stuffed bunny as she took a seat. Her voice was quiet but steady as she recounted the events that led her to speak out. She described how her mother had coached her to lie, how she had been punished for questioning her, and how much she missed her father. "Why did you decide to tell the truth now?" Judge Carter asked. Sophie glanced down at her bunny, her fingers fidgeting with its worn ear. "Because it felt wrong," she said softly. "I didn't want to hurt Dad anymore. And I was scared of what Mom might do if I didn't say what she wanted." Judge Carter's heart ached as she watched the little girl's trembling hands. "You did the right thing, Sophie," she said, her voice warm and reassuring. When Sophie finished, Judge Carter turned to Mrs. Harper. "Mrs. Harper, you've made serious accusations against Sophie's father, and now your daughter has refuted them under oath. What do you have to say to that?" Mrs. Harper's face twisted with a mixture of rage and desperation. "She's been brainwashed," she cried. "Her father has been manipulating her from the start." Mr. Daniels stood, his voice measured. "Your Honor, the only manipulation here has been from Mrs. Harper. Sophie's testimony is consistent, and there's no evidence to suggest she's been coerced by her father." Judge Carter tapped her pen against the desk, her expression unreadable. "I will not make any rulings today," she said. "But this court will proceed with a full investigation, including psychological evaluations for both parents and a forensic audit of the claims made by both sides." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing as Sophie's father emerged with his lawyer. Mrs. Harper stayed behind, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses as she slipped into a waiting car. The media frenzy only heightened the stakes, but Judge Carter knew her priority was safeguarding Sophie. That evening, Judge Carter reviewed the case files again, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. She thought back to Sophie's testimony, the raw honesty in her voice, and the fear that lingered just beneath the surface. The child's words carried a weight that couldn't be ignored, but the case was far from over. At the temporary foster home, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, drawing pictures of happier times with her father. Her foster mother watched from the doorway, her heart breaking for the little girl who had been thrust into such a turbulent world. Sophie looked up as the doorbell rang. Moments later, Amanda, the social worker, entered the room with a warm smile. "Hi, Sophie," she said. "I just came by to see how you're doing." "I'm okay," Sophie replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Amanda sat beside her, studying the drawing. "That's a beautiful picture. Is that you and your dad?" Sophie nodded, her eyes lighting up. "He used to take me to the park every Saturday. We'd get ice cream and feed the ducks." Amanda smiled. "That sounds wonderful. I know he misses you a lot." "I miss him too," Sophie said quietly. "Do you think I'll get to live with him again?" Amanda hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "We're doing everything we can to make sure you're safe and happy, Sophie. It might take some time, but I promise we're working hard to figure everything out." Sophie nodded, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Thank you." Meanwhile, Mrs. Harper sat alone in her home, her mind racing. She poured herself another glass of wine, her hand trembling as she scrolled through her phone. News outlets were already speculating about the case, painting her in an unflattering light. The walls seemed to close in on her as the reality of her crumbling narrative began to sink in. But Mrs. Harper wasn't ready to give up. She picked up her phone and dialed a number, her voice low and desperate. "We need to talk," she said. "Now. Have you ever witnessed someone speak up against something wrong, even when it was difficult? What do you think about Sophie's decision to tell the truth?" Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story to spread awareness of the importance of courage and honesty. The tension in the case only intensified as the court's investigation deepened. Psychological evaluations were ordered, financial records were scrutinized, and interviews were conducted with teachers, neighbors, and anyone else who could shed light on the truth. It seemed every stone was being turned over, and beneath each one lay new layers of complexity. Judge Carter spent her days juggling court hearings and late nights reviewing evidence. The pressure of the case weighed heavily on her shoulders. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Sophie's story was more than just the brave words of a child. It was a map leading straight to a web of deceit. At the foster home, Sophie was adjusting, though the absence of her father weighed heavily on her. Amanda, the social worker, made frequent visits to check in on her, bringing small comforts like coloring books and puzzles. One afternoon, as Sophie colored quietly at the kitchen table, Amanda arrived with unexpected news. "Sophie, there's someone here to see you," she said with a smile. Sophie's eyes lit up. "Dad." Amanda shook her head gently. "Not yet. But it's someone who cares about you very much." A familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was Sophie's grandmother, her father's mother. Tears brimmed in the older woman's eyes as she stepped forward. "Oh, my sweet girl," she said, kneeling to hug Sophie tightly. "Grandma!" Sophie cried, throwing her arms around her. For the first time in days, the heaviness lifted, replaced by a moment of pure joy. Amanda explained that Sophie's grandmother had been approved to take her into temporary care, pending the outcome of the investigation. "You'll be staying with her for now," Amanda said. "Would that make you happy?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically, her smile wide. "Yes. I love Grandma." Sophie's grandmother looked at Amanda with gratitude. "Thank you for this. I'll make sure she's safe and loved." Meanwhile, Sophie's father, Michael, was working tirelessly with his lawyer to build his case. The weight of the allegations against him had been lifted by Sophie's brave testimony, but his fight was far from over. Mrs. Harper's legal team was relentless, filing motions and making public statements to cast doubt on Sophie's claims. Michael sat across from his lawyer, his jaw tight with frustration. "What more do they need?" he asked. Sophie told them the truth. "Isn't that enough?" His lawyer, Mr. Daniels, leaned back in his chair, his expression cautious. "It's not just about Sophie's testimony, Michael. We have to prove a pattern of behavior from Mrs. Harper, something undeniable. That's what will sway the court." Michael ran a hand through his hair, his heart aching. "I just want my daughter back. She's been through enough." "You're doing everything right," Daniels assured him. "Stay patient. The truth has a way of coming to light. As the investigation pressed forward, a new lead emerged, one that threatened to shatter Mrs. Harper's narrative entirely. A former nanny who had worked for the Harpers years ago came forward, offering to testify. Her statement was a bombshell. She recounted witnessing Mrs. Harper coaching Sophie to lie, berating her when she resisted, and even threatening her. Judge Carter read the statement with a growing sense of clarity. This case was no longer just about custody. It was about protecting Sophie from a parent who had weaponized her love and trust. In the meantime, Mrs. Harper's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She ignored her lawyer's advice, lashed out during interviews, and made public appearances that only fueled speculation about her stability. The media painted her as a desperate woman clinging to a crumbling facade, and the court's growing evidence seemed to support that narrative. One night, alone in her dimly lit living room, Mrs. Harper stared at the television as a news anchor detailed the latest developments in the case. The words psychological abuse and coercion echoed in her ears. She threw her wine glass across the room, the shattering sound cutting through the silence. "This isn't over," she muttered to herself, her voice trembling with rage. She picked up her phone and made another call. "I don't care what it takes. Fix this." Back at her chambers, Judge Carter received an urgent report from the lead investigator assigned to the case. "Your Honor," he said, "we've uncovered financial records that suggest Mrs. Harper has been using funds from Sophie's child support for personal expenses. Luxury trips, high-end shopping, things that don't align with the intended purpose of the support." Judge Carter's expression darkened. "This corroborates the claims of neglect," she said. "This case is becoming clearer by the day." But clarity didn't mean the battle was over. With Mrs. Harper's unpredictable behavior, the judge knew the situation could escalate at any moment. And she was right. One evening, as Sophie played quietly in her grandmother's living room, a car pulled up outside. Sophie's grandmother peeked through the curtains and froze. "Oh no," she whispered, her hand trembling as she reached for her phone. It was Mrs. Harper, standing outside the car with a frantic look on her face. She marched up to the door and began pounding on it. "Sophie," she yelled, "come out here right now." Sophie's grandmother quickly called the police, her voice shaking as she explained the situation. "She's not supposed to be here," she said. "She's scaring Sophie." Sophie clung to her grandmother, her eyes wide with fear. "Why is she here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Don't worry, sweetie," her grandmother said, holding her tightly. "The police are on their way." As the sound of sirens approached, Mrs. Harper's shouts grew more desperate. "You can't keep her from me," she screamed. "She's my daughter." The flashing lights illuminated the driveway as officers arrived, instructing Mrs. Harper to step away from the house. She resisted, shouting incoherently as they restrained her. From inside, Sophie watched, her little face pressed against her grandmother's chest. Tears streamed down her cheeks as the chaos unfolded, her heart pounding with fear and confusion. In that moment, it became painfully clear. This fight wasn't just about custody. It was about survival, and Sophie was caught in the middle of it all. The next morning, the events of the previous night dominated every conversation in Judge Carter's chambers. The police report detailing Mrs. Harper's attempt to confront Sophie at her grandmother's house painted a clear picture of escalating instability. Judge Carter sat behind her desk, her fingers steepled as she listened to the lead investigator's summary. "Your Honor," the investigator said, "Mrs. Harper violated the court's temporary custody order by attempting to approach Sophie. This is a serious infraction, and combined with her behavior in court, it raises significant concerns about her capacity to act in Sophie's best interests." Judge Carter nodded grimly. "This reinforces what Sophie has been saying all along. But we still need to ensure our decisions are airtight. This case will likely face appeals no matter how we rule." The investigator hesitated, then added, "There's more, Your Honor. We've reviewed additional financial records and correspondence that further support the allegations of manipulation and emotional abuse. There's even evidence suggesting she threatened other individuals involved in Sophie's care." Judge Carter's face hardened. "Proceed with compiling all this information into a comprehensive report. We need every detail on record." Across town, Sophie's father, Michael, was at his lawyer's office reviewing the latest developments. "This has to be enough," Michael said, his voice tinged with desperation. "She showed up at my mother's house, screaming like a maniac. She's a danger to Sophie." Mr. Daniels nodded. It's damning evidence, no question. But we can't let our guard down. Mrs. Harper's legal team will do everything they can to spin this. Michael leaned back in his chair, exhaustion evident in his posture. I just want Sophie to feel safe. She shouldn't have to live in fear of her own mother. You're doing everything you can, Daniels said. Stay strong. The court is leaning in your favor, but we have to let the process play out. Meanwhile, Sophie was settling into her grandmother's home, the warmth and familiarity offering her a sense of stability she hadn't felt in a long time. Her grandmother, an attentive and loving woman, made it her mission to create a safe and nurturing environment. One afternoon, Sophie sat on the porch, coloring in a sketchbook while her grandmother tended to a small garden. "Grandma," Sophie said, breaking the peaceful silence, "do you think Mom is mad at me?" Her grandmother paused, wiping her hands on her apron as she sat beside Sophie. "Honey, your mom is going through some things that make her act in ways she shouldn't. But none of this is your fault." Sophie looked down at her drawing. "I just want everything to be okay again." Her grandmother hugged her tightly. "It will be, sweet girl. It will be." Back at the courthouse, the investigation reached a critical juncture. Judge Carter convened another closed hearing, this time armed with a comprehensive report compiled by the investigators. Both legal teams were present, as were Michael and Mrs. Harper, who sat on opposite sides of the room. The atmosphere was charged as Judge Carter addressed the courtroom. "The evidence presented in this case paints a troubling picture," she began. "This court has reviewed documentation of coercion, emotional abuse, and financial misconduct, as well as recent actions that demonstrate a blatant disregard for this court's orders." Mrs. Harper's lawyer, Ms. Latham, stood to object. "Your Honor, my client maintains that these allegations are exaggerated and that she acted out of concern for her daughter's well-being." Judge Carter's expression remained firm. "Ms. Latham, your client's actions speak louder than her claims. Sophie's safety and emotional health are this court's top priority, and Mrs. Harper's behavior has repeatedly put both at risk." Turning her attention to Michael, Judge Carter softened slightly. "Mr. Harper, the court recognizes your efforts to provide a stable and nurturing environment for Sophie. Based on the evidence, I am prepared to grant you full custody, pending a final ruling after a thorough psychological evaluation." Michael's face flooded with relief, while Mrs. Harper erupted from her seat. "You can't do this," she shouted. "She's my daughter." Judge Carter banged her gavel. "Mrs. Harper, sit down or you will be held in contempt." Mrs. Harper's lawyer tried to calm her, but it was no use. Her outburst only solidified the court's concerns about her stability. Judge Carter took a deep breath before continuing. "This court will issue a permanent ruling once all evaluations are complete. Until then, Sophie will remain in her father's care." The gavel fell, and the hearing concluded. Later that evening, Sophie returned to her father's home for the first time in months. The moment she walked through the door, she broke into a smile. "Daddy," she cried, running into Michael's arms. He lifted her off the ground, hugging her tightly. "I missed you so much, sweetheart," he said, his voice breaking. "I missed you too," Sophie whispered. As they sat down to dinner, the weight of the past weeks began to lift. Michael knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Sophie was home, and he would do everything in his power to keep her safe. But far away, in the quiet of her dimly lit apartment, Mrs. Harper sat alone, staring at the stack of legal documents on her kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. "This isn't over," she muttered to herself, dialing a number. When the line connected, her voice was cold and deliberate. "I need help. I'm not losing my daughter without a fight." The storm, it seemed, was far from over. The final hearing for Sophie's custody case was set, and the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Media outlets lined the sidewalks outside, reporters eager for any scraps of information about the case that had captivated the nation. Inside, the atmosphere was tense as both parties prepared for the day that would decide Sophie's future. Michael sat beside his lawyer, Mr. Daniels, reviewing their arguments one last time. Across the aisle, Mrs. Harper appeared composed, but her eyes betrayed a simmering intensity. Her lawyer, Ms. Latham, whispered strategies in her ear, though even she seemed resigned to an uphill battle. At the bench, Judge Carter entered, her expression firm yet calm. The courtroom rose and then settled, the weight of the moment palpable. This hearing will determine the permanent custody arrangement for Sophie Harper, the judge began. The court has reviewed all evidence, testimony, and evaluations. Today, we will hear final arguments before rendering a decision. The first to speak was Mr. Daniels. "Your Honor," he began, "this case has always been about one thing, the best interest of Sophie. Over the past weeks, we've demonstrated a pattern of coercion, emotional abuse, and instability on the part of Mrs. Harper. Sophie has suffered greatly under her mother's care, and her bravery in speaking out has shed light on the truth. She deserves a stable, loving home, which her father has always provided." Daniels concluded by presenting psychological evaluations of Michael, which painted him as a compassionate and capable parent. "The evidence is overwhelming, Your Honor. Sophie belongs with her father." Ms. Latham countered with a forceful argument, claiming that Mrs. Harper had acted out of love and concern for her daughter. "While mistakes may have been made," she argued, "it does not erase the deep bond between mother and child. Mrs. Harper is willing to undergo counseling and make any changes necessary to prove she is fit to care for Sophie." Her words were compelling, but the courtroom's mood remained skeptical. The mounting evidence against Mrs. Harper had become impossible to ignore. Judge Carter leaned forward, addressing both sides. "Before I make my decision, I will allow Sophie to speak if she wishes. Sophie, would you like to share anything with the court?" Sophie, seated quietly with Amanda in a nearby room, was brought in. She clutched her bunny tightly as she walked to the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she climbed onto the chair. "Hi, Sophie," Judge Carter said gently. "You've already been very brave. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about what you want?" Sophie nodded, her voice small but clear. "I just want to be happy. And I want to feel safe." She paused, looking at her father. "I feel safe with Dad. I don't feel scared anymore." Mrs. Harper shifted uncomfortably, her face pale. Sophie turned to her mother. "I love you, Mom," she said softly. "But I don't like the things you made me do. I just want you to stop being mad all the time." The simplicity of Sophie's words pierced the courtroom like a knife. There was no malice, only the raw honesty of a child longing for peace. When Sophie finished, Judge Carter thanked her and dismissed her from the stand. The judge took a long pause before speaking, the weight of her decision visible on her face. "This court's responsibility is to ensure the safety and well-being of the child," she began. Sophie's testimony, combined with overwhelming evidence, leaves no doubt that her father provides the environment she needs to thrive. Therefore, full custody is awarded to Michael Harper. A collective gasp filled the room. Mrs. Harper slumped in her chair, her lawyer placing a consoling hand on her shoulder. Judge Carter continued, "Mrs. Harper will have supervised visitation rights pending further evaluation. Counseling will be mandatory before any unsupervised visits are considered." As the gavel struck, Michael's face crumpled with relief. He leaned over to his lawyer, whispering, "It's finally over." In the days that followed, Sophie began her new life with her father. Their home was filled with laughter, games, and long talks that helped Sophie process everything she had been through. Michael enrolled her in therapy, where she learned to express her feelings and regain her confidence. Mrs. Harper, meanwhile, retreated from public view. She began attending court-ordered counseling, though her visits with Sophie remained sporadic and strained. One bright Saturday morning, Michael and Sophie were at the park, sharing ice cream and watching ducks paddle across the pond. Sophie looked up at her father, her eyes filled with hope. "Daddy," she said, "do you think things will ever go back to normal?" Michael smiled and brushed her curls from her face. "I don't know about normal," he said. "But I promise, we're going to make a new kind of happy. Just you and me." Sophie grinned and took another bite of her ice cream. For the first time in what felt like forever, she believed him. Sophie's story reminds us of the power of truth and the courage it takes to speak up, even when it's hard. What would you have done in her shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this story inspiring, like, subscribe, and share it with others. Let's spread the message that every voice matters, no matter how small.